This is an Irish independent podcast.
So on today's podcast, we are talking about an eye-catching aspect of the tennis world. Last year, the two best players on the planet, both ranked number one in the world in the male and female categories, had more than their tennis excellence in common. They both failed drugs tests, which was obviously a shocking look for the sport. One world number one pinged for anti-doping being unfortunate. Both world number ones seems a lot worse than careless. More intriguingly, both are currently free to play. Both Iga Swiatek in the women's and Jannik Sinner in the men's have been on court in Melbourne at the Australian Open this week. To what extent is there a cloud over their participation? To what extent is there a cloud over their sport? Nick Kyrgios, for instance, has called the situation disgusting. Happy to say a man to provide us with an educated, nuanced view of the situation is Dr. Ross Tucker. He has a PhD in exercise physiology. His Science of Sport podcast is exceptionally good, and it's great to have you on. Hi, Ross.
Yeah, it's great to be on. Thanks.
So let's dive in. Iga Swiatek needs very little introduction to tennis fans. She's 23 years of age. She's from Poland. She's a 5-time Grand Slam winner. She was world number one for 125 weeks up to late last year. She's won 4 of the last 5 French Opens. She is a superstar. In broad terms, she failed her test in August of last year and has received a 1-month ban. The International Tennis Integrity Agency find no significant fault or negligence, that this offence is on the lowest end of the range. We'll get into the contamination of her medication in a moment. But just first of all, TMZ is one of these substances that tends to arise in these kind of scenarios. From a performance-enhancing point of view, what will TMZ do for athletes?
I've never seen a study that has assessed that. But it comes up a lot, and the thing all TMZ cases have in common is they all come up in athletes from Eastern Europe and the Far East. So you may remember that there was a very controversial case before the Paris Olympics in 23 swimmers from China. The test was actually done well before the Paris Olympics, but it became newsworthy then. Theirs was a TMZ case. At the last Winter Olympic Games, the Russian figure skater Valieva was a TMZ case, which she also blamed on contamination. And so to answer your question as well as I possibly can, in the absence of a study, it's a drug that's used often to treat heart conditions. And I think it's found its way into sport because there's a thinking around it that it improves metabolism and improves heart health and function, which would have implications for endurance, performance, and fatigue resistance. So that's why it's banned, is because it's thought to have those benefits. But like most of the substances on the banned list, there's probably not a study that shows performance improvement of X in athletes who use TMZ.
Swiatek right away proclaimed her innocence. It took her a while to figure out what had happened. You know, we'll come to Sinner in due course. He seemed to straight away know what the offending source was. Swiatek had to look around for a time and came to the conclusion that she had taken melatonin. A lot of people familiar with melatonin. It's for to help with sleep, and claimed it was contaminated. A couple of things here. It's a low dosage. Maybe one of the big arguments in her favour here is that they found a very low dosage of TMZ in the melatonin medication, 50 picograms per milliliter, of urine, which is a real trace amount. A picogram being 1,000 of a nanogram, and there are 1 billion nanograms in a gram. So, I mean, we are talking trace amounts. I suppose, Ross, and this is the question, when people hear that, they will wonder, well, maybe she took a whole heap of this stuff a month before the test, and therefore they only found trace amounts. What was really in her favour is that tennis authorities are testing more. She was tested either side of the offending test, and there was no trace of TMZ in her system. Therefore, those two tests give a kind of reference point. It tallied with contamination because the two either side of it were TMZ free. So that really strengthened her argument, is my layman's reading of this.
I agree with you. I think it was the strongest thing in her defense. And in a sense, she was lucky because She was tested close enough to the positive sample that she could say X days before, and it was within a week, 7 or 8 days before, I had 0 in my urine. 7 or 8 days after, I had 0 in my urine. If I'm using this drug for performance enhancing effects and I'm taking a pill, the amount I'm ingesting is much, much higher than my contamination claim would have me taking. And therefore, I can explain that incredibly low concentration. Because without going into massive pharmacokinetics, what you measure being produced in the urine or excreted in the urine is a function of a few things. Number one, and the obvious thing, is how much did I take? How much time has gone by between taking it and getting the urine? And then metabolic situation, individual variation, dehydration, activity, etc. And so the fact that she can point to a very low concentration either side of a 0 suggests that what entered her system between point A and the positive must have also been incredibly low. In a sense, her first test alibis her second.
Yes, which is really lucky for her, I suppose, because we are all skeptical, if not cynical, at this stage with good reason. And if that other test wasn't there within a week of her guilty test, would you believe her? Not really. I mean, she would have been tarnished in a serious way forever.
Yeah, I mean, she'd probably claim she has been anyway, because your reputation will never be perfectly clean. But I think it is true that it helped her a lot. I don't know that it completely absolves her, because I still don't know. I haven't seen the studies that have said that a small dose of TMZ may not have some benefit, nor do I know with confidence how long it takes to clear TMZ. Like if I took a small dose today, Wednesday, and you measured me in 6 days' time, how much would you measure in the urine? There are studies, I suppose we'll get onto when we talk about the Sinner case, that he used in his defense. And those studies showed that contamination could explain the levels that he had detected in his urine, but at very low concentrations also. So I don't know that it completely deals with the contamination case, but it certainly helped her.
Fair point. Another thing just to mention about the situation is that the Tennis Integrity Agency asked for the package, that the melatonin package, to be sent to Salt Lake City for testing, but also they managed to find an unopened batch, the same batch unopened, so to avoid tampering, and that was tested as well, and that seemed to tally with her explanation. It was quite striking, by the way, that this was a medical product as opposed to a supplement. So when they're trying to deduce here, well, what's the punishment and what's the responsibility? They seem to talk a lot about the fact, well, this was a medical product, not a supplement. The point being, supplement is kind of Wild West territory. She's within her rights to think medicines are regulated. Is that about fair?
Yeah, and that was the reason she doesn't get 6 months or 2 years, because there have been cases of athletes who've used supplements and who I genuinely do think were caught as a consequence of contamination of that supplement. But what the authorities then say is, hang on a moment, you've walked into a store and you've bought a supplement from a company, and no matter how you try and assure us that you took the necessary steps to ensure that that supplement was clean, it's a supplement. It's produced as part of a system or a supply chain that is just not regulated. We should be able to, I think most people would agree, have a much higher degree of confidence in medicines to be verified, trustworthy, and not contaminated. And therefore, if you take a medicine, you can argue to the courts that I did all that I could as an athlete to not fall foul of a contamination case. If you take a supplement, you lose that, in a sense, high ground. And so she, I don't know whether you'd call it luck. I suppose some would say, depending on your position, it's bad luck to take a contaminated medicine. But that's eventually what happens. Melatonin is, as far as medicines go, one of the gray ones, because you can walk into a pharmacy in the United States and buy it off the shelf as if it was a supplement, whereas in some countries it's prescription only. And so the reason she gets any ban at all is because she took this medicine, but it's closer to the Wild West than most medicines are. And that's why she gets any ban at all. Some people would say that was a little bit harsh. I think what they eventually decided is that she probably could have done a little bit more because it was melatonin.
Okay. It's all very textured, this, isn't it? And layered and complicated, and different jurisdictions come into play. Like, it was noteworthy that when she's filling out the form of things she's taking, there were 14 supplements and medicines listed. Now, I dare say most of us are not taking 14. And I'm sure she's not an anomaly. I'm sure this is part of the slightly, up to, and in some cases including the line, medicalization of professional sport.
Oh, absolutely. I think the aforementioned Kamila Valieva was in the 50s when she fell foul of anti-doping testing in figure skating. She's taken 50 something. I think it was 56. I may not be exactly right, but that was the number, and it's astonishing. And so the supplements are so pervasive among athletes, and it must be for sure considered one of the biggest risks that an athlete can take is taking a supplement.
Yes.
And that's why anti-doping authorities do quite a lot. They try really hard to educate athletes about not taking supplements unless you have batch tested the specific supplement batch that you're about to take. And there are companies that do that for you. And I know, for instance, that in Australia, they'll say, if you take any supplement outside of this batch, here's a list, you're on your own.
Yeah.
If you take a supplement from that batch, then we'll defend you if you ever fall foul of a doping test.
Okay.
So it's a
we touched on this area when the Sinner news was in the news before Christmas, and it was kind of, it's more of a freewheeling conversation, and we were talking about supplements generally, not medicines, but supplements. And obviously, in pretty much every case that happens now, the well-worn defense book is contamination. You can almost bet your life that's what most athletes will say. There's some kind of contamination here. When it comes to supplements, not medicine, do we have any idea of how prevalent contamination of a supplement is? I understand it's not the most regulated of industries. Like, are there accepted statistics out there of how likely a supplement you take is to be contaminated? What would your sense of that world be?
There have been some independent surveys where researchers have gone and bought out a dozen supplements from the sort of local pharmacy or supplement store. And then they test them, and they're asking two questions: does this thing contain what it says it should? And does this not contain anything that it should? So, right. In other words, is it contaminated, and is it actually missing things? And without going into names, I actually was contacted with one elite athlete who was making a supplement claim. And I said, look, everyone makes this claim. The only way out of this for you is you've got to show that the supplement that you were taking contained the substance that they found in your body. So go and test that supplement, check it out, and so on. He was taking two supplements. The one that he ended up failing the test for was not in the supplement it was supposed to be in, and the one that he failed the test for was in the one it wasn't supposed to be in. So I know that's convoluted, but in the end, he's taking two products, product A and B, and product A contains B, and B contained A. And so he was done for doping by virtue of a contamination and a false negative. And I just remember seeing the result, and his lawyer said to me, this is what had happened. I said, this is the best illustration I've ever seen of the supplement world. And to answer your question, those studies generally show that about 20% of supplements, and this obviously depends where you test now and which supplements you do test, because some are more stringently regulated than others. Good practice, good manufacturing practice. But I think it was between 20 and 30% of supplements contained at least one ingredient that was not listed on the label. And about 20 to 30% of supplements do not contain what was listed on the label. So you could be just buying powder with no ingredients in it, or you could be buying a banned substance that will get you banned for 2 years.
Wow. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, why would you do it?
Yeah, maybe that is, I guess that's where strict liability comes in. That if you're an athlete buying a supplement, given those stats that you've mentioned, and certainly if you're not batch testing, that's where strict liability, which can seem harsh in certain instances, i.e. it's all your responsibility. If you're buying a supplement, listening to you, there's a degree of, well, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, he's spinning the barrel, it's roulette. It's the roulette, Russian roulette equivalent of doping.
Yeah.
And that's the problem is, as you said earlier, like every single doping case I can think of in the last 24 months it was contamination.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if not. And so strict liability exists so that contamination excuse isn't overwhelmingly in the favor of the athlete. Because without strict liability, how would the authorities ever prove that it wasn't contamination? So you have to set it up like that.
Yes. So to round off the Swiatek case, given the amounts in her system and the tests just prior to the offending test, and given the fact she took a medicine as opposed to a supplement, does a month here sound about right? Is this as kosher a situation as you can tend to get in these instances, or do you have misgivings?
I think it's about right. The only thing I'd add to that, the other thing in her favor, of course, and you did allude to it, is she sends a closed batch of the same melatonin to the lab. They test it and they confirm that it is the source of the contaminant in the right amount. So another story, I remember a cyclist had failed a test for testosterone and also blamed contamination, contacted me, and at my suggestion, he sent it to a local laboratory to test it. And sure enough, they found the testosterone in his protein powder, but the amount in the protein powder was so low. It was about 100th of what was eventually tested in his urine. And there's no way you can ingest 100th of what eventually comes out of your body. And so he used the contamination appeal, but because the amount wasn't consistent with his story, his 2-year ban ended up increased to 6. So he rolled the dice, as it were, and lost. So that was the other thing. I just wanted to add that. But the only thing in the decision that I read that made me go, I wonder if that's correct, is they had to take the word of the pharmaceutical company that produced the melatonin as to their standards of manufacture. They didn't have the opportunity to go and actually investigate that to ensure that that company was a reputable company in Poland where she got the substance. So it was kind of an assurance that was made, because you recall the legal firms tried to contact the company in Poland to get the product, and they simply flat out refused. And so they couldn't follow that all the way to its necessary conclusion. So that was a small gap. But other than that, I thought her case was pretty much as strong as a contamination case could be. And so in that respect, a month felt like, and remember, it was almost like a backdated month because she'd already sat out for a while. It felt to me like more of a message than a ban, and I think it was appropriate.
Okay, let's turn to Jannik Sinner then, which is maybe a more complicated situation. Jannik Sinner is the dominant force really in the men's game. 23 years of age, just like Swiatek, 23 years of age. He is the reigning Australian Open champion. He's the reigning US Open champion. Last year, as well as being number one, he also won 8 other titles on the ATP Tour. This was a historically great season. And yet lurking in the background right the way through was a positive drugs test in March. So both of Sinner's positive tests came in March 2024. The first was in competition in Indian Wells, California, and the second was out of competition a week later. Unlike Swiatek, he was never suspended, and that in part is because straight away, within a day of the positive test, he pinpointed the source. He said, this is the cream, this is what happened. So, not quite contamination. It's interesting. He talks about healing spray. So, there was an over-the-counter healing spray, which contained clostebol, which we'll come to in a moment. And this spray is available over the counter in Italy. So in effect, his physio, Giacomo Naldi, cut his hand and then used this spray on the cut, which contained clostebol. And the physio, Naldi, he then conducted massages on Sinner, which led to transdermal contamination. The clostebol going from the healing spray on his hand into Jannik Sinner's system. That is the argument. They, again, like Swiatek, they talk about tiny, tiny amounts. 86 picograms per litre and 76 picograms per litre on the two different tests. So Professor David Cowan, who's a member of the Tennis Integrity Tribunal, he said in the final ruling, even if the administration had been intentional, the minute amounts likely to have been administered would not have had any relevant doping or performance-enhancing effect upon the player. Maybe that's not the key point, but that was one of the things they said. I'll get into how likely that kind of transdermal contamination is from hand into just system. But when I saw clostebol being an anabolic steroid, Unlike TMZ, the effects of this here are a little bit more clear-cut from a performance-enhancing point of view, Ross. Big role in East German state sponsorship during the 70s and 80s. Shortens recovery times following intense workouts, allows for expedited production of muscle mass, similar to testosterone in that respect. It is, we should add, it is an ingredient found in certain healing creams and sprays available in Italy. So not in many other countries, but it is in healing creams in Italy, which is the point. So that is worth mentioning. But I guess when you see clostebol, anabolic steroid, you sit up a bit straighter, no?
Yeah, you do. And especially because it's got that history that you allude to from East Germany. There was a really fascinating article that was written at the time where you can trace its use, where it was very clearly used for doping, deliberate doping, for a period, and then it sort of falls off the map and it reemerges in Italy, where there's a spate of these contamination arguments. I'm sure some of them could have been genuine contaminations, but there's no doubt it was also being used for doping, and only in Italy, which was interesting. It's again, if TMZ is the Eastern European and Far East drug, this is the Italian one, and it has a reputation that anyone familiar with doping and pharmaceuticals would know of, and I think that's relevant because why would you? I suppose this is the key question. If you're a fitness coach and a masseuse or physiotherapist for an international, not just any international high-performance athlete, the best tennis player in the world, why would you buy it in Italy and fly it halfway across the world to risk an accidental contamination of your athlete? That to me is the single biggest question around this case. But anyway, we're maybe jumping ahead.
Yeah.
Point is, clostebol raises eyebrows here.
Okay. So this notion that Kutz's hand puts on this spray, and we'll come to your point, why of all places fly this spray from Italy all the way to California to use? But hey, look, Italian camp, this is maybe their thing, I don't know. Spray on hand because of his cut, massages tennis player, therefore tennis player absorbs it. Does the science of that stack up? That'd be a well-accepted reason how it might have ended up in his system, or no?
It does, actually, and he produced a paper in his defense that actually had been set up specifically to look at this, not surprisingly, from an Italian university where, and this isn't like a study that Sinner commissioned, right? This was a study that already existed before he had ever tested positive, maybe even heard of clostebol. And what the study did is it explored different ways that you could be contaminated. So, for instance, participant A uses the clostebol cream in the prescribed method and then shakes hands with half a dozen people. So that's a very short contact, a few seconds at a time. Test those 6 people over the course of the next 48 hours and see if you can detect it. And they could. And so it's stacked up in terms of it is possible to transfer clostebol in a massage cream from one person to another, even through very short contacts, let alone what would happen in a massage session for an elite athlete. So he's able to make the case for the source of the positive test.
Okay. Do we get a good answer as to why they bought this, aside from the fact that they're Italians, the kind of the carelessness when it's well known that the clostebol is in these sprays sold in Italy over the counter? Did they ever give a good explanation as to why they bought it there of all places? Or like is profound ignorance, carelessness about their best explanation of this?
Yeah, and that's a dodgy one because one of the two, the strength and conditioning coach, the fitness trainer, is actually a pharmacologist, pharmacist in a former life. And one of the arguments that Sinner actually makes, because Sinner, just to take almost a step back to the concept here, the moment an athlete's urine contains a banned substance, they now have to justify how it got there. Yeah. And Sinner's going to say it wasn't his fault. But in order to clear the bar for it wasn't my fault, he has to show that he took every possible precaution. And one of the precautions that he explains he took was to deliberately hire people who are qualified in the world of anti-doping so that they would avoid this. And so you end up in this almost paradoxical situation where they're arguing ignorance and carelessness, but he's having to argue that they're highly competent and wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that's what he does. The other paragraph I remember that struck me in that decision was they report what I'm almost certain is a fictional conversation, at least the way it's told, is he comes to dinner one night and he sees that his physiotherapist has got a plaster on his finger, and he says, "What happened?" And the physiotherapist says, "I cut my finger." And Sinner asks him, "Are you taking anything for it?" And that almost has to be there, because the court needed to be persuaded that Sinner saw the potential risk, clarified whether the risk was real or not, as in, are you taking something banned, and was assured no, everything was.
Yes.
And therefore, Sinner can stand up and say, "I did what I could. I held up my end of this bargain."
Yes, because that's a point here to make, because when we read all these cases and you see things like no fault or negligence, so Sinner was given a ruling of no fault or negligence. Now, that is a technical term. That's not just like how we might talk in layman's terms. That is a technical term, because in Swiatek's case and lots of other cases, the verdict might be no significant fault or negligence. Whereas with Sinner, they've said no fault or negligence. It's absolute. And therefore, that conversation about the plaster, that will feed into not no significant fault. We're talking no fault here. What's also interesting about the Sinner case is, usual case, if you're done for doping deliberately, it's a 4-year ban. If it's unintentional, it's 2 years. But if you get this technical term which Sinner received, which is no fault or negligence, that allows further reduction from 2 years. And in effect, he was given no ban whatsoever. This was so not your fault that there is no ban here. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is WADA have stepped in and said, we're appealing this. We're going to CAS. This is going to be heard in April. So there is still a showdown. There is still a shadow hanging over Sinner. CAS have intervened and they said, we are appealing this and we want a ban of up to 2 years and we're taking you to CAS. What has WADA seen here that they think is egregious?
So I think it gets quite legal, because WADA has actually specifically said that they do not contest that Sinner wasn't at fault.
Right, okay.
But they contest that, so they've actually come out and said, we don't actually dispute anything that Sinner said. We accept Sinner's version of events. We accept that the source of the positive test was the contamination by the physio, as you previously explained. We also accept that Sinner did take steps to ensure that he didn't fail the test. But what we disagree with is the final decision that there should be no ban served at all, because they are going to argue that even though it's a contamination case, there should still be some degree of fault.
Okay.
Like with Swiatek. So Swiatek wasn't completely cleared because the court decided that she might have done a little bit more. In effect, the court is saying, did you do all that you could? Swiatek is saying yes, and the court's saying, we sort of believe mostly yes, but actually we think you could have done a bit more. I think what WADA is saying is that Sinner could have done more and that he should still be liable for what was in his system. So in effect, the focal point of the CAS hearing and the appeal will be strict liability. How far does strict liability go? Is the athlete responsible for what his or her medical staff pack, travel with, use on themselves, and then could contaminate them? I think WADA is going to say that the athlete should be more responsible than the first decision concluded that he should have been, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and if you look at those decisions, both the Sinner and the Swiatek one, they do explain in quite a lot of detail what significant fault means, what no fault means. Both athletes are guilty of anti-doping rule violations. That part's not even contested, but the contested part is to what extent did the athlete bear the fault for that positive test. And they explain very clearly the things the athlete needs to show. And I think those are going to be the subject of conversation when the case happens in Lausanne or online, however it's going to play out in April.
Okay, it's very interesting. Because, to zoom out for a second, I mean, Sinner in his first round in Melbourne was playing Nicolas Jarry, the Chilean top 100 ranked tennis player. And of course, you couldn't make it up. Jarry served an 11-month ban in 2020 because he took multivitamins made in Brazil. His doctor recommended them. And of course, they were contaminated. So there were 2 metabolic agents in his supplements. So, you've got Sinner and he's playing Jarry. It's the first round. And you've got Swiatek. And so everybody has the right to be skeptical and cynical here. And you step back and you say, God, but to be fair, when you lay out these 2 situations on Sinner's part and on Swiatek's part, and you take them in isolation, they seem relatively credible. And the authorities do seem to have been relatively thorough in how they've examined the cases. Is that fair, or is that a very naive thing to say?
No, it's fair, especially the Swiatek one, which I think on the balance is a little bit stronger than Sinner's, in part because, as we discussed, not to repeat now, but she has 3 samples. Sinner didn't have it. So when you read that quote by, was it David Cowan?
Yes.
And he spoke about low concentration suggests, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, the low concentration could suggest contamination, but it could also suggest that he used it a long, long time before you tested him.
Yes, and
Sinner's got that.
He doesn't have, like Swiatek, he doesn't have, hey, here's a test from a week ago which showed there was none of this in my system, therefore a trace amount would suggest contamination. So you could argue, well, hang on, he took a whole heap of clostebol 6 weeks ago, and naturally there are only trace amounts left. That would be a question mark over him.
Yeah, exactly. And then what follows that is it's a different drug. It's a drug that's known in the country that he's from. So maybe you should take a few more precautions than that. But the question there is, who needs to take those precautions? Is it the responsibility of the player to pack the medical bag before he goes on a trip? Or is it the responsibility of the qualified medical people who are employed in that? And that's where I think the Sinner case gets so interesting, is because if WADA rules in favor, if CAS rules in favor of WADA, they will effectively be raising the bar for how liable the athlete is for their medical provisions.
I see, yeah.
Now, I know that to some degree, with Swiatek have done the same thing. They said, look, a doctor's prescribed melatonin. You're just, I don't mean to be disparaging, you're just a player. You're good at tennis. The doctor's good at medicine. So in theory, we should have a system where we can trust that the doctor does the right thing. But the 1 month ban to Swiatek was kind of like a light warning to say, listen, just because a doctor gives you something, don't think you're completely free here or clear.
Yeah.
With Sinner, I think it's a bit bigger than that, because what it's effectively saying is that you now as a player would need to audit your medical staff and what they do. And that's it. I don't know. There's something in me that's a little uneasy about that. Tennis players are there to play tennis. They're not there to be medical managers of their medical experts. At what point do the lines cross over there? Yeah. So I think that's what's interesting. And so I think in isolation, the 2 cases, if I had to choose which one I believe more, it's Swiatek. And I genuinely don't know. There's a chance that Sinner is using clostebol deliberately, knowing that it's in the cream, knowing that if he's ever caught, he's got a ready-made defense from contamination, because, hey, here's a study. The study precedes me using this. So it's possible that it's just a really clever way of doping. But you can't prove it, right? So therefore you have to say that the player is clear. But maybe CAS will explore some things that the initial decision didn't.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
regardless, though, I do think it has got real implications for what strict liability means for an athlete's medical staff.
Yeah. I suppose what goes against Sinner, if you follow that thesis out, that potentially Italian knows that this substance is in these creams, and look, massage away, and we've got this ready-made kind of explanation if it ever comes to it. What kind of would make you think, God, that's very possible? It's just the general landscape, of suspicion which hangs over everybody. And, you have people talking about the uncastrated boar that they ate, and then it turns out they'd probably have needed to be eating about 6 boars a day for it to have resulted in what's in their system, So you kind of, that goes against him here. On the one hand, the better angel on your shoulder wants to say, this 23-year-old who doesn't really peak of his powers, a prodigy right the way through, doesn't need to do this. It's not like he's arrived in the big time and found it terribly difficult. So, God, that could just be an unfortunate instance. And of course, then it's very easy for anyone to go, well, look, look at all these other cases, therefore. And that can be, that cause and effect is a very specific thing, and yet you've got to be fair to people as well. Yeah,
and that's why I think it was a couple of weeks ago, sometime in that period that's a blur between Christmas, New Year, I think it was, WADA announced that they are 2 things. One is they're having a strong look at changing anti-doping so that these low levels are almost always dismissed as contaminations.
Right.
I find that really problematic. I still don't understand. I haven't heard a good argument for why a low concentration means contamination, unless it's surrounded by 2 zeros, which I think we've discussed now. It's got to be bookended by 2 zeros for it to have meaning.
Yeah.
But the other thing that they said is that they may in future withhold announcing positive tests when the levels are so low because of the reputational damage and the conversation that it kicks off and the doubt and the skepticism. And that's also, for a number of reasons, that scenario to me feels worse than announcing them. And I've seen Nick Kyrgios talking for months about this and saying it's how bad it is. I'm still not sure which part of it Nick Kyrgios thinks is bad, whether it's the fact that it's public or whether the fact that it's happened. But if you don't announce these things and you actually close down transparency, that I think it becomes much worse. In fact, I dare say that in the last 20 years of anti-doping in a number of sports, including tennis, there've probably been secret bans that haven't been announced. And they've dealt with them because they don't want this fallout. So in one respect, the fact that we're discussing these two, and actually there was another one last year, Simona Halep. Her case. So 3 big high-profile cases in tennis. I'd rather know they're happening than not, even if when they happen, they are confusing and negative for the sport.
Yeah. The alternative is Andre Agassi writes his book and reveals something 20 years later, and then all bets are off. And that the Agassi revelation hangs over the sport ever since.
Exactly. So, and you know, like it played out, Emma Raducanu in Australia said she was nervous to take a cream, was it for a bite? Because she's now worried about anti-doping. If these decisions aren't announced, then athletes don't learn anything from them. So I think there's another reason that you announce them. But all in all, like, you'd rather not have them. But if the behavior is there, you need to have these discussions in public.
Okay. Very interesting. Thanks so much for taking us through that. And, you know, the significant thing is we've just talked about this in depth for 35, 36 minutes. Most people in the world will not listen to this podcast. I'm sure our egos can take that revelation, Ross. And so for Swiatek and for Sinner, there's just a general air of cloud over them. But so be it, say you.
Yeah, and I think in time it'll go away. And I remember Maria Sharapova was done for doping, Maldonium. Now everyone watches and no one remembers it. So in the end, this will pass for them, I think, among most people whose memories are short, but it exists over them. And I think anti-doping really has to get a grip on these situations. I don't think lumping them all together as contamination is going to be the answer, but I don't know what the answer is. And I know that's a terribly not constructive conclusion to reach here, but there's got to be a better way to handle these cases than was handled here.
Okay.
Because all these accusations double standards, that wasn't true. Everyone's got the right to appeal the decision and at the time that it happens. But I think it's been muddied so badly that they probably regret now ever testing the urine on those days. And that's not what anti-doping needs to have. Anti-doping needs to want to find people, not want to find them.
Dr. Ross Tucker, brilliant insight into all of that. Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure. Anytime. Appreciate it. Thank you.